Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for another installment of Exploring Our World, where we here at Colonial Williamsburg dive into the minds and experiences of 18th century daily life. My name is Davia Brown, and I'm joined by Cash Arehart, and today we're going to be talking about voting and elections in colonial Virginia. Cash, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Davia. I've been with Colonial Williamsburg since 2001, and I presently serve as the supervisor of the Capitol building. So I have the opportunity to do a lot of research and look into some of the history of elections and voting practices, not only in colonial Virginia, but throughout the history of our nation.
Thank you again for joining us, Cash. So we are going to be talking about voting and elections, but we hope that you'll send in your questions for us to answer during this live stream. Just type them into the comment section, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But let's begin our conversation by having you, Cash, tell us about the differences between elections and voting in the 18th century in Virginia and what they're different from for us today.
So a lot of the differences in our election process and voting today and our counterparts in colonial Virginia have to do with who was able to vote, where that voting would take place, and how their votes were recorded. Starting off with who, in order to vote in colonial Virginia, let's pick 1770 as an example, 250 years ago. It was only free, white, Protestant, property-owning men who were able to exercise the franchise, as they referred to the practice of voting. And the property ownership could vary. You either had to own at least 100 acres of land, and an acre is about the size of a football field today. Or you could own 25 acres of land with a house on it. And you had to own that property for at least 1 year previous to the election day in order to satisfy that requirement to vote. So it was only a very small percentage of the population in each county who satisfied all of those requirements to vote. The second difference, where voting would happen, it didn't happen in private like we think of today. Instead, it's a very public event that happens at the local courthouse. And then the third difference really is going to be in how that voting process plays out. It starts with the royal governor. The royal governor would call for public elections to take place as often as required, or when the House of Burgesses, the lower house of the colonial legislature, had been dissolved, he told them all to go home, or upon the arrival of a new governor or a new monarch. The previous king or queen dies, a new king ascends to the throne, you have to have new elections. At that point, the royal governor would instruct all of the sheriffs throughout Virginia by issuing a writ of the election. Here you can see a picture of the sheriff nailing the writ to the door of the courthouse. The notice of the election would also be read at church as well. All government elections are going to be advertised in this way, promoted in these public venues. And it's going to happen with at least 20 days notice. Typically 4 to 6 weeks is the average. So you had about a month before the election was going to take place at the courthouse.
So talking about those requirements for voting, it sounds like it's a very, very small portion of the population, since we know that colonial Virginia was very diverse. Mm-hmm. And that means that a very small fragment of the population could actually hold office then as well, correct?
Exactly. If you look at Fairfax County, for example, during the period of time that George Washington is elected as one of the Burgesses to represent that county, it's only 25% of the white men in that county who satisfy all of the other requirements to vote. The property ownership, being at least 21 years old, and being a Protestant Christian, I should specify. Before 1750, you actually had to be a member of the Church of England. That was the official state church in Virginia. But as you begin to see more settlement out in the western part of Virginia, moving out into the Shenandoah Valley, beyond the Piedmont region of Virginia, there are a lot of German immigrants who are members of the Lutheran faith. You see a lot of Scots-Irish who are Presbyterians. You begin to see other Methodists and even some Quakers out in that part of Virginia. So the power holders here in Williamsburg, the elites in the Tidewater part of Virginia, closer to the coast, recognized that they needed to expand voting rights out in the frontier of Virginia, out in that western part that kept expanding and growing. So they actively had to make it easier for more people to vote out in that part of Virginia so that they could be adequately represented in Virginia's colonial legislature.
So what did Election Day actually look like in colonial Virginia?
Well, we'll use Colonel Washington still as an example. It was only 25% of the men who in Fairfax County were able to satisfy all of those requirements to vote. So we've got an image of what that would look like. This is the courthouse in Williamsburg. If it's only a small percentage of the free white men who satisfy all of those requirements, being able to own property, be a Protestant, be at least 21 years of age, be a free person. Each of those individuals, in some counties, it might only be 100 men. In other counties farther west, you might see a larger percentage because more people have access to own land out there. They all show up at the county courthouse on Election Day. And not just the men, their wives, their children, single women who own property in the community, members of the black community, free and enslaved. Everybody comes out on Election Day. And in the image here, you can see the candidates for office. These are the men who are running to be Burgesses in Virginia's legislature, in the House of Burgesses. It's like a representative. They're seated, and next to them are clerks at the table with the green cloth. The clerks are there to record the votes. They're going to make sure that each and every vote is accurately counted. Standing behind them in the brown coat, you see the sheriff. It's the sheriff's job to open the election and to make sure that only voters who satisfy all of those requirements are able to vote. And then each individual voter would step forward and publicly declare who they were voting for. So they would announce in front of the entire community which candidates they were casting their votes. The sheriff might deny someone if they were suspected to not satisfy all of those requirements, so an individual might be turned away. At the end of the day, the sheriff would announce the winner. He would close the election and he would say, "Congratulations, Mr. Dog and Mr. Cat, you are the winners of the election. You're going to be the Burgesses to represent this county in the next General Assembly." If you thought that there was a problem, today when you vote, there are phone numbers that you can call if you have difficulty voting or if you have problems with your ballots. You can appeal that process. The same is true in the 18th century. You would actually go to the Committee for Privileges and Elections, which is made up of members of the House of Burgesses. You have to remember the House of Burgesses, those are the only elected representatives in Virginia's entire government. Here's a picture of the chamber at the Capitol building where the Burgesses meet. Those two Burgesses from every county, along with one from the cities of Williamsburg and Norfolk, one from the College of William and Mary, and one from Jamestown, even though there's only two families that live out at Jamestown by the time you get to the American Revolution, the Amblers and the Travises. And they would just alternate back and forth. One General Assembly, someone from the Ambler family would go to Williamsburg. The next time, somebody from the Travis family would go, and they would just decide amongst themselves who got that seat. And that was a custom that we inherited from England. Virginia, more than any other colony, really works to try to replicate that English model of representative government that you see in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords in the British Parliament.
Please, viewers, send in your questions for us to answer as we continue this live stream. But Cash, we're going to shift now to how the elections change. So we know that there are definitely some similarities and differences in how elections today work compared to the past. But when we declare independence and change from a colony to a state, how do those elections and those processes of voting start to change?
You might expect that when we switch from being the colony of Virginia to being the Commonwealth or the state of Virginia, that there were a lot of things that changed immediately. But that wasn't the case. You begin to see the expansion of more access to voting, more voting rights extended to a larger percentage of the population, but it happens pretty slowly. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson introduces the Statutes for Religious Freedom. That's a bill that will make it possible for people who aren't only Protestant Christians to be involved directly in Virginia's government, whether that's by voting or by holding office. But it takes a decade to pass that bill. It's not until 1786 that the Statutes for Religious Freedom are finally ratified into law. So that's the first big change, is relaxing that requirement of a religious qualification to be able to vote or hold office in the government. And then gradually you begin to see some of the property requirements relaxed. And that was something that had actually started happening in colonial Virginia before independence was declared. There were a couple of times that the General Assembly of Virginia passed a bill that would have reduced the property requirement from only 100 acres of land to 50 acres of land. And it passed by the House of Burgesses, it passed the royal governor and the council, and then it was sent to the king. And both of those times, the king's administration back in England vetoed that bill. They didn't want to extend voting rights to a larger percentage of the population. So that's something that begins happening after we declare independence. And then, of course, it's not until later on, after the American Civil War, with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that you begin to see African American men receive the franchise, that they're able to exercise their right to vote. It's not until the 20th century that you see constitutional amendments passed that enable women with the right to vote, or that the voting age is lowered from 21 to 18. Or that other minority groups, such as American Indians and Latinos and Latinas, are able to exercise their right to vote. So we tend to think of the expansion of voting rights in the United States as this very smooth process. It just happens every couple of generations. More people get the right to vote, but that doesn't recognize all of the struggle and the hardship that happened over so many generations, taking the power of voting, the ability to directly influence your government, and give that power to a larger percentage of the American population. When you think about it, that was one of the big arguments for the Declaration of Independence in the first place, the recognition that Parliament, which was not a body elected by the people of Virginia, that they were passing laws against American colonists who did not have the ability to remove members of the House of Commons from office. They said that they had no right to representation while being taxed. So the Americans decided if the king and parliament weren't going to recognize their rights as British subjects to representation in their government, that they would declare independence, they would create their own government that would protect those rights to representation in their government, among so many other rights of a free people.
I think it's especially important to point out when we talk about how enfranchisement works over time, that one of the reasons that disenfranchisement was something that was such an issue and still is for a lot of people today is people who have power often don't want to share it. So maybe it's not so much that they don't want people to vote as they don't want people who might not agree with what the people who are in power are doing or thinking or saying.
Absolutely.
So we actually do have some questions from our audience. Thank you for sending those in, and please continue to send in your questions. Chris wants to know, did the process of open voting that we saw in the 18th century have ties to patronage, as in people supporting any candidate to receive favors both at the colony and local levels?
That's a great question. And you see the General Assembly in Virginia, and when I refer to the General Assembly, that is the body of the government that are able to make laws, the legislature. It consists of the members of the House of Burgesses, the lower house of the legislature, directly representative of the people and their interess, and then the upper house, which is a body more removed. It's supposed to be a more stable, more contemplative body. And even today you see that in Congress. The United States Senate, senators only stand for election every 6 years, as opposed to every member of the United States House of Representatives, where they have to stand for election every 2 years. The General Assembly is able to, I'm sorry, the question just went right out of my head. I apologize.
That's all right. Why, Chris had wanted to know, sorry, trying to find the question now. It's lost in the stream of things.
Sorry.
Did the process of open voting have ties to patronage?
Oh, yes. So the General Assembly of Virginia, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Recognizes that requirement to own land is supposed to insulate the election process. The idea is that only individuals who have a permanent or what they would think of as a vested interest in the community, so taxpayers, landowners, these are the people who are most affected by government policies. These are the people who have to pay taxes more so than any other members of the community, that it's only those individuals who should be able to vote. Imagine if I was renting my home and my landlord came to me and said, "Cash, I want you to vote for Mr. Byrd in the next election." What if I don't like Mr. Byrd? But if I don't vote for him, my landlord could throw me out of my house. So that idea of people being able to exercise their own free will without fear of repercussion is something that has to be recognized in the colonial period, because they have these public elections. Everyone had to profess in front of the community which candidate they were voting for. It's something that you see as an argument against the secret ballot. If your vote is secret, how do you know that the sheriff or the clerk or some other individual doesn't pour a bunch of extra ballots into the ballot box on election day, or that they don't burn a whole bunch, or just simply not count some of the votes? So the open vote, the public vote, is actually thought of at the time as a protection for voter integrity. As you have that requirement of property ownership, though, there were instances in colonial Virginia where there was one man who was standing for election as a member of the House of Burgesses, and he and a couple other individuals in the county got together along with a clerk, and they were signing deeds. The member running for election, the candidate, was selling at very steeply discounted rates, maybe 1 acre or 2 acres of land to these individuals, signing off a deed. And this is a point in time where it took just a small amount of property to be able to vote. So the man was essentially buying votes by giving out this land, and that's when the Burgesses came in and they raised the property ownership requirements to try to make it more difficult for individuals who didn't secure enough property, who didn't own enough property to be able to exercise the franchise.
And then a follow-up from Christian, when did we change from public to private ballot?
We begin, it's a great question, Christian. You begin to see the introduction of the secret ballot in elections in the 19th century. This is something that begins in some states before the American Civil War, and then especially after the American Civil War. There's a lot to do with race, as well as you see the expansion of voting rights among African American men during Reconstruction. They instituted the secret ballot in many of those states so that these newly enfranchised voters, these formerly enslaved men, were able to freely exercise their will at the ballot box. If they were still doing a public vote, then it would be very easy for some ill-designing individuals to threaten or to intimidate voters. And we still see that today. The idea of voter intimidation was one that we heard a lot of, the possibility happening in the run-up to the most recent election.
And speaking of our elections and our current elections, we seem to have some viewers who are watching from outside of the United States. So I think it would help for them to better understand a bit about how our election process works. In particular, the Electoral College. One of our viewers, Elizabeth, actually wants to know, when did it begin? And I'll add to that, can you briefly explain how it works?
Certainly. Explaining the Electoral College briefly, that's no problem at all.
Do your best. Just do your best. Just don't be Patrick Henry.
So the Electoral College is a institution. It is a mechanism. It's not a physical place like a college campus. Really, it's a group that exists for presidential elections every 4 years. When Americans go to the polls on Election Day, on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November every 4 years, they are voting to decide whether or not one of the major parties, usually the Democratic or the Republican Party, will choose electors. These are loyal party members who then get together at a date after the general election. If their candidate received a majority of the votes in their state, they get to assign all of the electoral votes to their candidate. So, for example, Virginia has voted for Joe Biden in this most recent election. Texas voted for Donald Trump. So Virginia's 13 electoral votes will be assigned to the Democratic Party. That means party members of the Democratic Party get together and they will say, we're going to give all 13 of our votes to Vice President Biden. All of Texas's electoral votes, Republicans, since they won the majority in that state, will assign all of their electoral votes to President Trump. And then you have to get to a majority of the electoral votes in that election to be declared president. Right now, and since the 1920s, that number is 270. That's the magic number, 270 votes. The idea of the Electoral College was to help prevent or to help insulate the electoral process from the tyranny of the majority, as it was thought of historically, or mob rule. Remember, in the 18th century, the idea of letting the people exercise so much power over their government was a very radical concept. It was very new, and many of the founders did not want to have the election of an office as powerful as the president to be one that was conducted through a simple majority of the people. So that's where they get the idea of the Electoral College. They also recognize that that's going to help to spread out the influence of the people. Otherwise, the idea was only individuals in large population centers, the cities of the time, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston, would have greater influence in the political process than the vast majority of Americans at the time who lived out in more rural areas. In the 20th century, that's changed. You see more Americans living in cities now, and I think that's part of why you see a lot of talk about abolishing the Electoral College or reforming the Electoral College process. Part of why it doesn't work today as the way the founders intended, though, it actually has to do with Thomas Jefferson. After Jefferson was elected president in 1800, he begins to promote the idea of what we refer to as the winner-take-all system. That means if one candidate wins the majority of the popular vote in that state, they get all of that state's electoral votes. As it had been designed, each individual congressional district would award one vote to a candidate, and then the two other votes for the state would be awarded to whichever candidate won the majority of votes in that state. Jefferson starts promoting this idea of the winner-take-all system, and that's where you begin to run into problems where the candidate who wins the popular vote can actually lose in the Electoral College. And we've seen that happen several times throughout the nation's history. The first time was in 1824, when it was another Adams, John Quincy Adams, won the popular vote but lost the popular vote, wins the electoral vote, and then it happens more recently in 2020, and then before the courts intervened, and then in 2016 in the last election with President Donald Trump.
So we have our question from Doug. What sort of provenance was required from a man to validate his eligibility to vote, and how could he prove it?
That was the job of the sheriff on Election Day in colonial Virginia. Bear in mind, your county sheriff is an individual who is known to the community and knows the community. It's the sheriff's job to know who the different eligible voters are. And not only is it the expectation that eligible voters are going to participate on Election Day, it was actually the law. You had to come out and vote if you satisfied those voting requirements. If you did not vote, then you could be found guilty of failing to exercise your civic duty and made to pay a fine. It's a concept or policy known as compulsory voting. If you can vote, you must vote. That's practiced in several countries around the world today. Even in Australia is the first country that comes to mind that has compulsory voting. If you don't vote, you're made to pay a small monetary fine if you fail to exercise that civic duty.
And that actually answers Doug's follow-up question, which was, were there repercussions for not voting? Now, we've seen from what you've explained over the Electoral College that our state and our country has evolved and changed as our times have changed. More people who have been given voting rights, and more different types of challenges and benefits depending on which state you go to when it comes to how those voting rights are extended. Christian wants to know, why did Virginia follow the English model so closely in our colonial era, and why did other colonies, later states, not follow as closely?
That really helps to demonstrate that idea of the colonies being very separate and very distinct entities. Before the American Revolution, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania are as foreign to Virginia as France and Spain. I use hyperbole here, but only to a degree. Most of each individual colony's business, their trade, their commerce, is either with England as the mother country or with other entities, either the French or the Sugar Islands and the Caribbean. There isn't a whole lot of interaction between the different colonies in North America. Really, it's the fact that Parliament begins to encroach upon the rights of these 13 colonies in America that they begin to coalesce around this idea of a common interest in eventually declare independence. You see Virginia adopting very closely the English model of government, much more so than just about any of the other colonies. And part of that is heritage. Remember, Virginia is the oldest of the English colonies in mainland America. It is the largest, it is the wealthiest, and it is the most populous at the time of the American Revolution. Even King Charles II, he refers to the colony of Virginia when he ascends to the throne following the English Civil War as my loyal old dominion. That's where the nickname, the Old Dominion, comes from as the nickname for Virginia today. They referred to the General Assembly of Virginia as a little parliament, where they're really trying to emulate that model of the House of Burgesses as the lower house, similar to the House of Commons, and then the Council as the House of Lords, working in close conjunction with the royal governor, the king's directly appointed representative. The other colonies don't adhere as closely to that model because they come into being for different reasons. Even though Virginia was established initially as a commercial venture, it very quickly receives a charter to be a royal colony. But North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Georgia, these are set up as proprietary colonies. These are colonies that are run as businesses. So they might have a board of directors back in England who are selecting governors. They aren't as expected to adhere as closely to that English model of government as you see here in Virginia.
So we have a couple of questions about women voting from Ben and Sean. For those of you who don't know, this year in 2020, we're celebrating 100 years of women getting the right to vote in America. Ben wants to know about Virginia giving rights to women to vote, and Sean wants to know about women property owners. Were they given any say during elections, even if they couldn't vote?
Those are great questions, and it's wonderful that we get to recognize and celebrate the 100th anniversary of the constitutional amendment granting all American women the right to vote. But it also obscures a couple of historical facts. In 1699, the General Assembly of Virginia changed the law specifically disallowing women from being able to vote. We've never found any research that indicates that women attempted to vote in 17th century Virginia, but the fact that they wrote it into the law does make me raise my eyebrow in curiosity. We also know that in New Jersey, when they adopted their state constitution after declaring independence, there was language written into their constitution that refers to all persons who satisfy these certain requirements, instead of strictly all men satisfying those requirements to be able to vote. And we have recorded documentation of hundreds of women voting in New Jersey between 1790 and 1810. At that point, they changed the law. They restrict or disenfranchise women from being able to vote at that point. In Virginia specifically, you don't see a whole lot of historical evidence of women asking for the vote or requesting the vote. And not even in New Jersey. They didn't write that into their constitution as the result of protests and lobbying, similar to what we saw with the suffrage movement in the late 19th and early 20th century in America. Rather, this seemed to have been an experiment in expanding voting rights to demonstrate that we had a new style of government. We had a new way of thinking about individual citizens and their relationship with their government, and that they backpedaled on that experiment later on in the early 19th century. But of course, women who own property, they still have to pay taxes in colonial Virginia. They still are expected to represent themselves in court. They exercise all of the same rights as any man who owns property as a freeholder, just they aren't able to directly influence their government by running for office or by voting.
Now, it is interesting because we talk about the 1920 amendment where all U.S. women could vote, but we know from later acts and laws that are passed, that's not necessarily the case. You think about black women not really getting their right to vote, at least recognized depending on what state they were in.
Yeah.
You think about Native American women who, like Native American men, weren't legally seen as citizens to this country yet. So a pattern that we do often see throughout history, and not just in America, is sometimes you can make something legal, doesn't mean that it's actually being enforced.
It's not until you see the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s that you begin to recognize the fulfillment of that promise of the will of the people, all eligible voters being able to freely exercise their civic duty and their right to vote at the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. Now, we do still have time for questions, so please continue to send those in. Doug wants to know, what made a man eligible to run for office in colonial Virginia? Could a non-landed man run?
That's a great question. Up until now, I've been referring primarily to the House of Burgesses. That's the lower house of the colonial legislature. It's that body that most elections would decide who gets to win that seat in government. You do also see examples of your church vestry council being elected. Anytime you create a new parish vestry or a larger parish vestry divides into two new parishes, you would have an election among the freeholders, eligible voters, to who could have those seats. You also saw in the city of Williamsburg and in the city of Norfolk a body called the Common Council and the Common Hall. The council would be the mayor and 6 aldermen. These are going to be more affluent, more well-to-do members of the community. There's a recorder as well. They kind of work as a clerk. And then you have the Common Council. These counselors, these are just 12 guys who maybe they're business owners. They could be tradesmen. So certainly not the most wealthy or most affluent members of the community, who are able to participate in some direct manner the course of their local government. Together, the Common Hall and the Common, making up the council, the aldermen of the city, the mayor, they are going to affect policy. They're the ones who will decide, here are the hours for the town market. Here's who will be responsible for organizing militia drills. Militias are also instances where you see men being elected to office. The militia company usually gets together and they'll elect different members. That's something you see early off in the United States Army, early in the American Revolution. Curiously, in Masonic lodges, also, the members of the lodge each have an equal vote. At the lodge here in Williamsburg, Peyton Randolph, he's the Speaker of the House of Burgesses. Later, he served as the President of the Continental Congresses in Philadelphia. He has an equal vote to some of the members who are blacksmiths, who are house builders, carpenters, tailors in the city. So even though in other parts of society, which are very thoroughly stratified, when they all go into the Masonic Lodge together, they are all thought of as having an equal right to vote in that body. So they elect officers and new members to the organization.
Now, we know that there were free blacks in 18th century Virginia, and Williamsburg in particular, were they able to run for office, or was it only white males who could run for office?
In 1699, the General Assembly of Virginia passes a couple of laws. That's when they specifically disenfranchise women, and they disenfranchise, in the words of the legislation of the time, Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians. The first two being names that they used in the period to refer to individuals with African ancestry, and then the last being American Indians. So the fact that the General Assembly of Virginia is specifically writing legislation to disenfranchise these individuals, it does beg the question, were there individuals who were able to either vote or hold office in 17th century Virginia? We also know of an example in 18th century Maryland where there is a black man, a free man, who holds office, who holds public office in that colony. So there are instances of men of African descent who are holding public office in colonial America, but they seem to be very few and certainly the exception rather than the rule.
And we unfortunately only have about 5 minutes left, so I think our last question is going to come from Sean, and this is going to have to require some briefness. When did the idea of the formation of political parties begin?
Oh gosh. So Sean, that's a great question. We like to, when I'm interpreting in the Capitol building here in Williamsburg, we talk about how the members of the House of Burgesses before the American Revolution, they are these noble individuals who rise above the idea of political party or faction, that they're there to represent the interests of the people rather than one political party or the other. So you don't really see a lot of examples of political parties or faction in colonial America. That begins to change almost immediately after we adopt the new federal constitution, and you see faction begin to develop during the term of George Washington as president. In what is commonly referred to as his farewell address, Washington warns the American people against the practice of political faction, is the term that he uses. But he's telling people, be weary, be cautious of, I'm sorry, not weary, leery. Oh, some people may be weary as well.
I'm definitely weary.
But be leery of political faction, because it's the job of a political party to promote its own beliefs and agenda, and not necessarily the interests of the people. So even before the year 1800, you've already begun to see developed pretty rigidly a Federalist Party, and then what Jefferson's adherents refer to as Democratic Republicans. Jefferson himself, he calls the movement the Spirit of 76. And then you begin to see an evolution of parties up until the mid-19th century. The Whigs as a party come and go. That's WHIGS, the Whigs. Are a political faction in the early 19th century. The Republican Party comes into being about the 1850s. Andrew Jackson is recognized as the leader of the Democratic Party. And so by the mid-19th century, these two major parties are pretty well established. And that's been the status quo for over 150 years now. Despite efforts of third-party movements, of independents, libertarians, the Green Party. You've seen other groups such as the Anti-Masonic Party, the Greenback Party, the Log Cabin Republicans over time as well. So there are other political interest groups throughout American history over the last 150 years, but the Democratic and the Republican Party have both really entrenched themselves as two major political groups, even though our political system and our Constitution was not designed for two major political parties to dominate our electoral process.
Thank you so much, Cash, for answering these questions and being our contextualizer for today. And I would just like to end by reminding everyone that there's still a lot of work that we can do outside of elections, outside of voting. One of the biggest things is to stay informed. So thank you for sending in your questions. I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer all of them, but we do have a lot of resources out there for you to connect to try to find more answers and think more deeply about voting and elections. Thank you also to our donors who, without their donations, we would not be able to do this program and many other programs here at Colonial Williamsburg. We hope to see you here physically visiting us at Colonial Williamsburg. We are open. Thank you again for joining us for this video, and have a wonderful day.